If you've ever been on the internet, and that's rhetorical, I realize you're on the internet right now, you'll know it's a place where a lot of people have a lot of opinions. That extends to guitar players and their opinions about guitars. And in the main, it's what you'd expect. I like this guitar, this is my favorite amplifier, I don't think this particular pedal is very good. And mostly people manage to discuss their opinions in a more or less civil manner. But there's one subject where the evidence is civil discussion is pretty much impossible because it immediately drives people into a whirlwind of unmitigated fury. And that is, should people make new guitars look like old guitars? Apologies for this, by the way, my wife is lasering off one of my old tattoos. Just to quickly qualify what we're talking about here, which is the art of artificially aging a guitar, otherwise known as relicing. There are 3 types of relicing. First, there's simulating what sunlight does to a guitar. Now, over the years, exposure to sunlight will fade certain types of dyes, like the red dyes on a vintage Les Paul, for instance. And it'll cause certain types of lacquers to go yellow. So you'll see, for instance, blue guitars that have turned green, or white guitars that have turned like a creamy color. Second, there's simulating changes in temperature and humidity. What you'll most commonly see there is cracks known as checking, where the expansion and contraction of the wood has caused the lacquer to crack in a distinctive pattern. And third, there's simulating mechanical damage or physical damage. Now that can range from the lightest of play wear, like changes in, for instance, the texture of a finish, right through to making your guitar look like it's been dragged behind a car and then dipped in a vat of acid. I'm not going to get into how you can achieve this with your guitar, that's for another video. What concerns us today are those discussions where someone starts off by saying something like, "I don't understand relics." Now, that's obviously not what they mean, but let's indulge them for a second. Relics exist because around 30 years ago, custom shops started making replicas of very expensive vintage guitars for people like Keith Richards to take on tour with them. The story goes that Keith complained he found the guitars felt too new, and would the custom shop mind bashing them around a bit for him? You can kind of put the rest of it together yourself, but the short version is some bright spark suggested making more of them and bringing them to market to see if there was any demand. Turns out there was a huge demand, and so since then, all kinds of guitar brands have been putting all kinds of artificial wear on their guitars. So why would you want one? Well, there's lots of reasons. A common one is that if a guitar has been reliced well, it feels played in. That broadly means its edges have been softened a little bit, like for example on the edges of a fretboard, which makes it more comfortable to play than a factory fresh guitar. Another reason is that a lot of people get anxiety about putting a scratch or a dent in a brand new guitar, and so they don't play it as much as they'd like to. If your guitar comes pre-worn, then you won't get that awful sinking feeling you get when you put the first bit of damage on an otherwise pristine guitar. A third reason is that a lot of people want to own replicas of their heroes' guitars. A lot of guitar heroes play actual vintage guitars that have been very, very worn by decades of touring. So to have a really faithful replica, you have to replicate those battle scars. Another reason is that they just look cool. Now, in my opinion, not every guitar looks good with a relic job. I tend to think that really only classic styles like Strats and Telecasters and Les Pauls, for instance, look good with a relic job, where more modern guitars like Ibanez or Schecter, for instance, don't quite look right. That's a lot to do with how newer guitars are built and finished. Which brings us to our last reason, which is that modern guitars just don't wear like older guitars, and that includes modern Strats and Teles and Les Pauls. Now, some modern guitars are finished with more fragile materials like thin coat nitrocellulose lacquer, but even so, you still have to play your guitar for 20 years to get anywhere close to that kind of look, and if you're the kind of person who's careful with your guitars, you may never really get there. As for guitars finished with polyurethane, they will literally never age like a vintage guitar, because polyurethane behaves in a completely different way to older guitar finishes. For most of us who will never afford a real vintage guitar, the only way to get something that looks vintage is to get a relic. Now, one thing I hope that we can all agree on is that relic guitars don't hurt anyone. It's no problem for other guitar players if I choose to have a relic guitar. The stores are still full of unrelic guitars for other guitar players to buy. Nobody is being made to own and play a relic guitar they don't want to own and play. And another thing is, you're allowed to think that relic guitars are fake and stupid. You're allowed to think that people who own them are posers. You're allowed to think that the only legitimate wear an instrument should have is the natural playing wear and accidental damage that comes about over many years of use. You are 100% allowed to think that. To think it. But let's get back to this gentleman, and it's always a man, who, having disingenuously claimed to not understand relics, now informs you that he thinks they're fake and stupid, and that the people who own them are posers, and that the only legitimate wear that an instrument should have is the natural playing wear and the accidental damage that comes about over many years of use. I have one response to this guy, which is that you, sir, are a dick. A dick, yes, and that's bad enough. But the real problem here is gatekeepers. If you're not familiar with that term, a gatekeeper is someone who has become so personally invested in a field of interest that they now believe they have a right to determine what other participants are allowed to do, or even whether they get to participate at all. An example of this would be how difficult women find it to get accepted into the gaming community, and being constantly required to prove that they're real fans. As if being a real fan is a legitimate requirement to begin with. You know, it might be objectively funny when a Kardashian wears a Motorhead t-shirt, but if you think the Kardashians should literally not be allowed to wear t-shirts of bands they don't listen to, then you're a gatekeeper. Today's discussion was a post a guy made on a Stratocaster appreciation group on Facebook. He'd uploaded a couple of pictures of his two apparently real 1960s Strats, supposedly to prove that only real wear looks like real wear. Was it true? I mean, not really. Assuming his guitars were real vintage Strats and that the wear was completely natural and incidental, there was nothing about them that looked any realer than your average custom shop Strat. But that's not even the point. His point is that people who have relics are just pretending to own actual vintage guitars, and they're not fooling anyone with their obvious fakes. Now, I've been playing guitar for at least as long as relics have been a thing, and I have never ever heard someone claim that their relic was an actual vintage guitar. I doubt this guy has either. What I suspect is that this guy owns these rare, special guitars, presumably not at insignificant cost, or maybe he's owned them from new. And in his mind, they're a little less rare and a little less special because anyone can just go into a store and grab a guitar that to most people might as well be the same guitar. I mean, I understand how that might sting a bit, even if I don't sympathize. The grown-up reaction to that would be to reason that there's nothing to be done about it, and to just enjoy the fact that I've got the real deal. But this guy, as so many before him, decided to appoint himself the gatekeeper of vintage guitars, and declared that anyone in possession of a guitar that looks old without actually being old is a fraud. Gatekeeping is unfortunately something I see a lot in the guitar community, whether it's this kind of relic bashing, which I see every day, or like earlier this week, where I saw another group of effects pedals enthusiasts eagerly agreeing that there should be some kind of exam that you have to take before being allowed to post gear reviews. You see people claiming that digital modeling amps aren't real amps, that real guitarists don't play Chinese guitars, or that you should be ashamed of having Behringer gear. It's always based around some kind of local consensus of what's cool, or worse, the idea that there's a minimum spend below which you can't be taken seriously. And a lot of you will be wondering, if you even got this far, why I'm so concerned about a lot of internet bickering. But here's the truth. Most people learn everything they know about gear from the internet. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I still learned most of what I know about gear from the internet. The internet is an incredible resource for information about what gear there is and how to use it. But unfortunately, it's also a place where bitter old men go to work out their insecurities. And that makes sense, you know, because the sad reality is that most musicians never get to live out their rock star fantasies. And the best a lot of them can achieve is to pose as an authority on equipment in front of more impressionable musicians. But because they're not actual authorities, that most often takes the form of criticizing other people's tastes while claiming their own taste should be the default. In conclusion, to all you people who go to the internet looking for gear advice, please continue to do so. There's loads of good people on here who are very generous with their time and knowledge. Just be wary of anyone telling you that their opinion or their way of doing things is the only legitimate one. Or anyone who says anything is crap without supplying categorical proof that it is in fact crap. And to anyone who thinks that relic guitars are just fakes for posers, keep thinking that. But keep it to yourself, yeah? I'll see you later.